All right, well, welcome once again to our first, if belated, live session because of all of the craziness and insanity that's been happening in the world and in everyone's life. So I'll open us with prayer and we will get going. Dear Father, we thank you again for this day and ask that you be with us now in this time as we learn to worship you better with our minds and a place dedicated to your glory. We pray that you be with us now. Give me the words to speak and give us all something to learn. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, well, organization and formatting. This is one of those topics that, quite frankly, can sound about as exciting as watching paint dry. But I think you'll find once we've been through it that if you really understand the two different aspects of what I'm talking about, once you learn to leverage it, it can help you take your writing to the next level. You can go beyond a lot of the really basic stuff that I see. And to be perfectly honest, as I've graded a lot of papers over the years, and if there are two problems that I see with a lot of my American students, it's going to be organization and formatting. And I can identify, because to be perfectly honest, I cannot recall, I'm sure somebody said it to me at some point, but I cannot really recall the time somebody actually explained this to me in a nutshell, at least not that it stuck. I sort of had to figure it out on my own as I go along. And a lot of the papers that I read, I get the same vibe, is that people are sort of guessing. They're doing things that increasingly make sense, and as they learn to do it better and better, they sort of hit on the things that we're going to flat out talk about. And so if you're able to really understand and leverage these aspects, particularly the organization that we're going to talk about, your essay writing will improve almost immediately. Your impact is going to be magnified significantly. So let's talk first about effective organization. Well, people often resent essay organization. And I say they resent it for no good reason. Why do you resent organization? Well, a lot of people that I've found don't like being dictated to. They don't like being told, you should write your essay in this way, because I guess they feel like their creativity is being stifled. Well, why isn't that a good reason? Well, the kinds of essays that we're talking about here, the sort of writing that you're going to do in this type of situation, isn't all about creativity. Now, don't get me wrong. I hope you're creative in everything that you do, and if you are successfully creative even in this type of writing, within the parameters that we're going to talk about, you can be an even more successful, profoundly so, writer than a lot of the other people who you're competing against. But at the same time, the purpose of this kind of writing that we're talking about isn't to be creative, it's to communicate truth. You're trying to get ideas out of your head and into someone else's, and you're trying to do it with the least amount of space and time possible, and you're trying to do it in the most effective and clear way possible. So from that perspective, if your creativity gets in the way of that kind of those goals, then your creativity is going to be counterproductive. And as we'll see, organization in the English language is a really big thing. Organization itself plays a key role in your ability to communicate and in people's ability to understand you. So it really doesn't make any sense for us to be frustrated with this idea of being dictated to by following an effective organization. And I guess it's like you're trying to hammer a nail into a board and someone hands you a hammer instead of a wrench, and you're mad because you don't want to use the hammer, you'd much rather use the wrench. Well, no, use the hammer. Use the tool that makes sense for the situation that you're in. And that's what this basic organization we're going to talk about is. Other people just sort of hate the extra step and the extra time. They don't like the idea of having to think that through. They want to just sit down and start writing and expect that whatever they write to be profound and wonderful and all of these other great things. Well, writing usually doesn't work that way. It's just a simple fact. Especially writing in the English language. Writing that is the most effective is writing that is well organized and that follows a certain pattern. Well, there's more than one pattern out there. I'm going to emphasize that too as we go along. There are many different ways to skin this cat, but I'm going to be talking about probably one of the most common and one of the most effective that you can use as a basis. So anyway, it's not an extra step if it's part of what actually makes you effective. So if you're one of those people who've sort of had this knee-jerk reaction to having to think about organization, to think about outlining your essays and whatnot, try to resist that temptation, because I think it'll be very important to you to develop as a writer of prose. And so the truth is, as I said, is that in English, intelligent structure is a part of good communication. And you can think about sentences just to begin with. Structure enables understanding. And when we compose a good, clear sentence, it has to follow a basic structure. So if you look at this first example I have here, ordered his troops, the general forward. Sounds like Yoda. Ordered his troops, the general forward. You have to stop and think about it. What in the world am I talking about? Ordered whose troops? The general's troops? His troops? The general forward? Are we moving the general forward? But if you just change the organization slightly into something that's more recognizable, the general ordered his troops forward. It's the same words, just organized differently and put into a more recognizable structure. Subject, verb, object. I mean, that's the way English works. Order is important. And the same thing is true. What's true of sentences is going to be equally true of paragraphs and beyond, to papers, to chapters, to dissertations, to even book series. Getting that organization right is very important. And again, the purpose of academic writing is to communicate as clearly as is humanly possible. You want to leave as little room for confusion as you can. Now, yes, if that means you're not being as stylishly vague as you might be if you were writing something for a creative writing class, yeah, well, I guess that's the price we pay to be effective. So, using this organization, thinking about it, and actually leveraging it well can be very important to continue to beat that dead horse. So, what is a basic adaptive organization? And again, to emphasize, there are several different ways you can go about this. The one I'm going to talk about here is one of the most structurally sound. It's the one that I generally advise people to use. You can, once you've gone a little farther and once you've gotten some more experience under your belt, you can start going beyond it. But my advice is master the basics first, and then you'll know how to break the rules. If you don't know the rules to begin with, you can't break them intelligently. You don't want to break the rules willy-nilly. You want to break the rules and have it make sense and have it be more effective than otherwise. So this is my advice as a starting point, but you can branch out later. So first, you start off with an introduction. None of that sounds like it's a very drastic thing to say. I'm sure you did not expect me to say that, but the fact is, I can't tell you how many essays that I read from all across the spectrum, from freshmen all the way to seniors, who skip that part essentially. They just sort of drop you into the middle of what they're talking about. Their first sentence is their thesis statement, and then they immediately start talking about whatever their topic is. That's not an introduction. The introduction is where you catch your reader's attention. Now, I'll pause there for just a second to say, right now, I'm here to read your papers. I'm here to be there for you and build you up and all the other great things that professors do, which means you guys have a captive audience. Whatever you write, I'm going to read. I'm at least going to look at it. You know, I mean, if you write something really, really bad, I might read it quickly and say this isn't acceptable. But if you're making a serious effort, I'm going to read what you have to say, and I'm going to send it back to you with feedback. But once you get out of your college class, nobody's going to read you because you're you. I mean, you know, I guess maybe once you've become a famous author, then they'll read what you have to say because you wrote it. But for the rest of us, you have to give people a reason to read what you have to say. So the very first sentence of your introduction has got to grab somebody by the nose and give them a reason to read the second sentence. And if you don't do that, they're going to throw you in the trash. And that is very much true if you're ever considering trying to publish something. I remember hearing from about one editor who says his philosophy is he will read your first sentence. If the first sentence holds his interest, he'll read your second sentence. If your second sentence holds his interest, he'll read your third. But if at any point during that first page or two that he gets to where he's like, I'm done, I've lost interest, he just throws the whole manuscript in the garbage. So in that introduction, it's extremely important. You hook your reader's attention. You grab them. You give them a reason to bring them in. Give them something that they want to they want to learn. They want to understand from you. You also have to introduce your topic. You can't assume that everybody is going to know what you're talking about before you start. I mean, if they're reading your paper, you know, again, I am the exception. I am the history professor. I'm reading your paper because this is a history class. But if you're writing anywhere else, and that's what I'm trying to train you to do, if the person has picked up what you've written, they probably want to learn about it. They don't know what this involves. At least, you know, not until you educate them. So you've got to give them in your introduction the very basic parameters that they need to properly interpret your thesis statement and to understand what's going on as they move further into your paper. Then you ask your question. Once people know what you're talking about, they're interested in what you're talking about, you have to let them know what you're doing here. What question prompted you to write this paper? What answer are you going to give us? You know, it's not Jeopardy. We don't read your paper first and then figure out what the question is. We need to know what your question is, and then you follow that up with your thesis statement, which should be the very last sentence of your introduction. You give us the question, you ask us this, you want to let us know this is what's going on, and then boom, right afterwards you answer it. You say, this is the truth. This is the argument. This is what my paper is going to establish. That is so, so important, because that thesis statement is the linchpin of your entire paper. In the end, if you prove your thesis statement, you've won. If you fail to prove your thesis statement, if I read through the whole paper and I look at it and I say, they just didn't do it. I mean, they made this one, and that can happen all kinds of different ways. I can look at it and I can say, they made one claim for a thesis statement in their introduction and their paper proves something completely different. Or I have no idea what their thesis statement is. You know, this is not clear where this is or what we're talking about. Or maybe you don't even give a thesis statement. That happens a lot, where people just end their introduction with their question and say, I'm going to talk about this wonderful topic. Okay, but what are you going to say? We have to actually know what you're going to say so we can hold you to that standard. And so that order, that organization, that placement of the thesis statement at the very end of your introduction, it opens the door for the rest of your paper and it lets us know where you're going. In shorter papers, you would put the thesis statement at the end of an introductory paragraph because you don't have much space. You got to introduce everything in one paragraph, end your paragraph with a thesis statement. If you're one of the 497 students who has a lot more room to play with, then maybe you're going to have an introductory section, and the last sentence of your section, or very close to it, is going to be your thesis statement. Then, of course, after the thesis statement, it opens up. You'll be shocked to hear, I'm sure, the body. one or more. Usually there are 3 minimum paragraphs. The most basic organizational form is 5 paragraphs total. Introduction, 3 body paragraphs, and a conclusion. And these body paragraphs must all point back and tie directly into your thesis, and they must prove it true. That thesis becomes the filter that you apply to the rest of your paper. If something in your paper does not directly relate to that thesis and prove it true, it does not belong in the paper. Now, there's lots of great information out there, of course, that you can talk about, but it doesn't necessarily belong in a particular paper. And that thesis statement is how you tell the difference. If it supports the thesis, this is something you can put in the paper. Or if I should say, if it addresses the thesis, because sometimes you're going to put in information, of course, that seems to contradict the thesis that you have to explain away and whatnot. So it doesn't. I'm not saying you ignore contradictory evidence, but if this does not relate to your thesis statement, even if it's wonderful stuff, set it aside. Save it for another paper. Do something different with it, but it does not belong here. Each paragraph is going to need a topic sentence. It's going to have evidence and analysis that proves that topic sentence true and explains and gives examples of it. And then it's going to give us a transition to move us along to the next paragraph, which is going to be on the next major topic. And then finally, your conclusion. The big thing to emphasize with the conclusion is that it contains no new information or analysis. Another really big thing I see it in book reviews in 201 and 202 all the time. I see it also in the 497 theses. People will talk and talk and talk and talk and talk, and then they'll give a paragraph of analysis where they talk about all this significant information they haven't talked about before, and then they just stop. Well, that's not a conclusion. A conclusion draws everything back together. It re-emphasizes the thesis without repeating it. It rediscusses all of the important information. It's your last chance to drive your point home. It's your last opportunity to really say, look at all of this stuff that we've covered. Look at all the things we've talked about. This is why this is true. And then also, and I'll mention this again later, as you leave your introduction or your conclusion, you oftentimes try to leave somebody with a sentence or an idea that's going to stick with them. When they walk away from your paper, you want them to still be thinking about your paper. In an ideal world, and this is true in general, in an ideal world, you want everybody, even me, to be thinking about what you had to say hours after it's over with. Do you want to be a really good writer? Write something in one of your papers that I wake up in the middle of the night thinking, man, that was a really good point. That's, wow, I have to really give that some more thought. And so your conclusion is where you have the chance to make that kind of thing stick. And again, as a writer, if you're wanting to develop as a writer, I can't overemphasize that, because this is what makes people come back to you. This is what makes people look at your stuff, look at what you're doing, and come back and decide, I want to read more by this person. And of course, if you're trying to be a paid writer, they'll come back and give you more money. So the introduction flowing through the body to the conclusion and containing all of these different things, very, very important. So when we look at this, I'm going to put this all up here. Virtually every good piece of academic writing uses some form of that organization that I just talked about. And if you're sitting here thinking, why are we even talking about this? I see this everywhere. Well, that's why we're talking about it, is because this is so effective that virtually every really good piece of writing, especially historical writing that you've read, is going to use some form of this organization. And that's true from discussion posts all the way to full-length books. And the reason why it works so well is because all you have to do is add or take away levels and length to make it appropriate to whatever level you're dealing with. You can think about sort of the shortest pieces of information that we would deal with in terms of prose as historians and students, and that would be a discussion board reply. Now, yeah, there are plenty of discussion board replies that are really terrible. I'm sure that we've all seen them. Unfortunately, I'm sure we've probably written a few of them. The ones that basically say in one sentence or less, "I agree, great job." That's not the kind of discussion reply I'm talking about. And I'm not talking about the discussion replies that are repeating, saying, I agree, great job, over and over using different words. But if you're talking about a really good one that actually gets into the real meat of it, if you look at it, it usually is a single paragraph. It has an introduction/thesis sentence that catches your attention and explains what your central point is. You've got several supporting sentences that point back to that thesis, and then you've got the conclusion sentence that really draws it together. And even a very short paragraph, 4 or 5 sentences, which is, of course, an actual paragraph, is going to have that sort of organization. Well, when you want to adapt that into a paper, what do? Well, this is something you should be pretty familiar with by now. You've got your introduction with the thesis, then you have the 5 or so paragraphs, and with topic sentences pointing back to the paper's thesis, and then you've got that conclusion that really draws it all together and drives it home. Well, what about taking it a step farther? What do you do when you're not just writing papers anymore? What do you want to do when you want to write a dissertation, or a thesis, a master's thesis, or a book even? Well, dissertations are basically books. Well, you have an introduction chapter. That introduction chapter has the thesis of the book in it. Then each major chapter resembles a paper, but the thesis of that chapter points back to the thesis of the book. So it's like taking each chapter is like it's like a paper. It's got its own thesis. It's got all of its body paragraphs. It's got its introduction. It's got its conclusion. But then you put another layer of organization over it, and the thesis of that chapter points to the central thesis of the book, which is explained in the introduction to the book and drawn together in the conclusion of the book. And you could go even farther. You could do a book series. Book series usually have a major theme or thesis of the series, and each book addresses one aspect of that theme. And then, of course, each chapter, and then it goes on down from there. The point is that rather than letting this stuff happen accidentally, rather than just trying to sort of mull your way through and let it sort of happen on its own, be actively thinking about this and leverage this organization to use it effectively. And I'm going to break this down a little more, because what I've found is that many students are familiar with what I've talked about so far. But when you actually start getting down into the nitty-gritty, you actually start dealing with what is in an introduction. We know what an introduction is supposed to do, but what does an introduction actually look like taken apart? People aren't really so sure about that. So, parts of the introduction. The very first thing that you normally have is what's called the hook. Pardon me. The hook is sort of like fishing. Yeah, it's the lure that grabs your reader and holds their attention. Usually it's something dramatic, or it's a pretty significant claim. It's something that makes you, I don't know if you're Star Trek fans, but it's something that makes you raise Mr. Spock's eyebrow. You see something interesting, you're like, wait a minute, what is that? I want to find out more about that. So in the particular example I've got here, the American Revolution nearly died at Valley Forge. Well, if you have any interest in history, the American Revolution almost died? What is this? What are we talking about here? And so people who may not have heard about Valley Forge, they start perking up. They start paying attention, and that makes them want to read a little farther, hopefully. And you'll notice it's a little dramatic. It's hopefully not over the top, but it's something that is stimulating, and that's the point of the hook. Then, once you've got the hook, you introduce your readers to the general topic. You're sort of bringing them in. This is a type of introduction called a funnel introduction. And so what you're doing is you're starting with the hook in a very, very broad topic, and you're gradually focusing in, getting more and more specific until you'll get down to your particular thesis. So to start broadly with the general topic, we might say, the colonial experience at Valley Forge was dramatic and for many deadly. So, okay, we're talking about, we're talking about the colonial experience, we're talking about what's happening at Valley Forge, and we're talking about people dying. I mean, obviously that's, pretty significant. Then you start to refine your topic. And the refining process can take anywhere from one sentence to several. In very, very long works, the refining process might actually take multiple paragraphs. But in the kinds of papers you guys are going to be writing, the refinement process is going to be several sentences. And so what you're doing is you're taking that really, really broad topic and you're zeroing in on your very specific point. So we've gone from the colonial experience, that's huge, down to the leadership of George Washington played an important role in ensuring the survival of the Continental Line. So we're not talking about everything that's happening at Valley Forge. We're going down to George Washington, and we're specifically looking about his leadership. Then you could do some more if you needed to, but then you get to the point where you throw the question out there. And this is the question that you're trying to answer in the paper. This is what people want to know. And so you ask, and it doesn't always have to be a question. I like using a question because when you ask a good question, people want to know the answer. And so that tends to set it up well, and it tends to keep them engaged. So the question in this case, what was it about George Washington's leadership that was so important? So now we've gotten even more refined. We want to know what did Washington do at Valley Forge that made the difference between success and failure. And then you hit them with your thesis statement. Last sentence of the paragraph, Washington's firm, calm presence, his willingness to suffer with his army, and wise planning made an important difference in the Valley Forge experience. Now, if you were writing this in a paper, I probably would ding you for doing things like overusing the word experience, overusing the word important, so on and so forth, but you get the idea. You've narrowed it down, and you've made a very clear statement. You've made a claim that you can prove. And that is one of the things that is very, very important, is that a thesis is not a topic, and a topic is not a thesis. A topic is just, this is the stuff that we're talking about. A thesis is, this is a particular claim, this is a particular position that I am trying to take, and I'm going to convince you that this is true. And if you stop and think about the differences between the two, a topic might be, this paper is about George Washington's leadership at Valley Forge. Okay, yeah, so what's the point? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it ugly? Is it beautiful? Did it get people killed? Did it save people's lives? Just saying this paper is about George Washington's leadership tells us nothing other than it's a paper about George Washington's leadership. The thesis that we have here, we're making a claim that Washington had a firm, calm presence. He had a willingness to suffer with his army, and he had wise planning. And we can go back, and at the end of the paper, you can say yes, you can say no. This is an argument that can be supported or denied. Incidentally, I'll also throw in there, too, as part of this thesis, you have what's called a plan of development. What we're basically setting up for our reader is that there are three main areas that we're going to be looking at and that they can expect us to talk about in relation to Washington's leadership. His willingness to suffer with his army, his calm presence, and his wise planning. So when you go to actually write the body paragraph for this essay, you would first start off talking about Washington's calm presence. That might be paragraph 1. Then you talk about his willingness to suffer with his army. That's paragraph 2. Then you talk about his wise planning. That's paragraph 3. And all through, you're talking about how those things made a difference. And I hope you see again how this organization is self-reinforcing. You've just said we're going to do 1, 2, and 3. Then you go back and you do 1, 2, and 3, and people understand what you're talking about, and they get it. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, but that's so repetitive, yeah, it is, and that is a good and a bad thing. It is a good thing in that properly done repetition actually gives you the ability to really get things to stick inside people's minds. I mean, when you try to memorize something, when you try to remember something, do you just read it once? Of course not. You hear it again and again and again and again, and that is what eventually helps make it stick. This is where the creativity comes in, and this is where what can separate a really good writer of prose from a poor one, is that you can get the repetition in there without making it obvious that you are being repetitious. So you're talking about things, but you're talking about things in the same order, but you're talking about them using different words, different phrasing. You are doing it in such a disarming way that people are repeating it without even realizing they're doing it. So that's sort of the ideal that you're going to be going for. And then one last important point again, that thesis statement should be the very last sentence of your introduction. You want it to be the last thing that people remember, because it then becomes the key that opens the door to the rest of your paper. We're going to interpret the rest of your paper based upon that thesis. That also is why it's so important that you get that thesis clear and right, because when you write a paper, let's say it's read by 100 different people, it could be interpreted 100 different ways if it does not have a clear thesis. You cannot possibly predict or control how 100 different people are going to read your paper, and, well, not without a clear thesis, and you can't plan for it. So if that happens, the vast majority of those people are going to think you don't know what you're talking about, because they're reading what they expect onto your paper, not what's actually there. Whereas if you give a good, clear, strong thesis, you control the discussion and then stick to that thesis. You make it hard for people to run off on their own rabbit trails. Anyway, the body paragraph. First, you transition, and I say transition if needed. Pardon me for one moment. Didn't want to cough in your ear. All right, so you transition first if needed, and I say if needed because sometimes it makes sense to have the transition happen in the previous paragraph. So if the last paragraph has given a transition, you may not need to put a transition in the beginning of a particular body paragraph. And so, for example, if you're going, your thesis statement is usually a wonderful transition. People recognize the thesis statement. Oh, I also meant to mention that. That's one of the reasons it's so important to put the thesis statement as the last sentence of that paragraph, is because people are conditioned to expect it there. And so we know this organization. We intuitively understand it. And so people look for that last sentence to be your thesis. And if that's not your thesis, it can just get really confusing. So if your thesis is well written and well placed, it sort of transitions for you. So the first sentence of your first body paragraph does not have to be a very clear transition. So use it if you need to. If not, it's not a big deal. What is absolutely indispensable, though, is that topic sentence. It generally comes early in the paragraph, within the first couple of sentences. Oftentimes it is first. Sometimes you have the transition, then you give the topic sentence. There are some versions of paragraphs out there where the topic sentence comes toward the very last, and if you can make that work, great. But most of the time, people are looking for that topic sentence within the first couple of sentences, because just like your thesis statement, people then know how to interpret the rest of that body paragraph. They will know what standard to hold it to, so on and so forth. If you can look at a paragraph and you can walk away going, I don't know what the topic sentence is here, then you need to go back and examine the organization of that paragraph. In fact, it's not a bad thing to do as you're reviewing your papers. See if you can highlight your own topic sentences. And if you realize that you can't, if you realize that you don't know yourself what the topic sentence of a paragraph you wrote is, then you need to go back and you need to recast that paragraph and figure out what your central point is. It's also one of the reasons why some people, I get feedback about overly long paragraphs. Well, one of the reasons why that happens is because the person writing the paragraph doesn't even know what the topic sentence is. They just have a general vague idea that I'm going to talk about this kind of stuff, and so they just start talking about stuff until they get tired of it. And sometimes that can go on for 2 and 3 pages. So knowing what your specific topic is for a particular body paragraph is important. It's going to keep you focused. Next, facts, evidence, and analysis supporting that topic sentence usually follow. Once you give that topic sentence, we got to understand it. You got to unpack it for us. You've got to prove it, for that matter. I keep saying this over the course of my career, and it has not ceased to be true, is that people don't care what you think. It's a simple fact. People don't care what I think. People don't care what anybody else thinks. They care what we can prove. They care what our research shows. So just saying something doesn't make it true, and it doesn't convince us that you're right. So you got to back it all up. You got to give all of that information, all that detail that makes us look back at that topic sentence and go, yes, I understand. That makes sense. Sometimes after you've given all of the facts and evidence, you're going to want to sort of add a zinger sentence in there about what does all of this mean. So some paragraphs have kind of a mini conclusion sentence that re-emphasizes the topic sentence. Now, it's not often used, so don't go through and automatically try to include this in every one of your paragraphs. You're just going to confuse people. But if it's a very important point, if this is something that you think really the reader must walk away with, or maybe if this is a longer paragraph, not too long, hopefully, and you think that people may have lost focus on the topic sentence, you might want to re-emphasize it, so you'll add that sentence in there as well. Then, as we said before, if you didn't transition, if you're not going to transition in the beginning of the next paragraph, you'll transition at the end of this one. So again, not needed if you're going to transition in the next paragraph, but here is where you would put that transition. What you're trying to do, by the way, transitions are another thing that people really, really overlook, because they just sort of talk until they think they're done, and then they just stop, and then they start talking about the next topic, whatever it is. The best way I can think to describe that effect on your reader is trying to drive through a residential neighborhood with speed bumps. Incidentally, in Poland, they call speed bumps sleeping policemen because they'll wake you up if you hit them. And so you're driving along and you're going pretty decent speed, everything's going fine, and then suddenly you hit one of those things and your head hits the roof and everything's jarred. And then by the time you figure out where you are, you've hit another one. Well, if you're not transitioning properly, that is what your reading, your prose, is going to sound like to your reader. They're just going to be getting hit again and again and again and again, one topic after another, and they're not going to see how all of this connects. We could probably do a whole session just about transitions. Maybe we will one day. But your goal with the transitions is to make your writing flow. You want it to be. I'm going to sound like a martial arts instructor. You want it to flow like a river. You step into the river and you're swept away and don't know where you're going to end. Anyway, you get the idea. You don't want it to be jarring. You want everything to flow one point into the next in such a smooth way that when you're done, people are going to look back and think, well, of course they had to do it this way. Every point followed from the one before. Everything that the person said was necessary and each one came from the step before. And that's what those transitions do. They tie everything together. So if you're not, what I would do, by the way, and I will plan to put a PDF of this up somewhere, maybe in an announcement. Go through and before you turn your papers in, look at your paragraphs, look at your whole essay, and look for this structure and see if you're missing these things. And then if you are, go back and look and add them. Oh, and I just made this point, but transitions are important, because if you do not have smooth transitions, basically people are going to think you're incoherent and illogical. Even if you aren't, it still feels that way. It still seems that way, because your transitions are what tie your thoughts together and give them that flow. So what about a conclusion? The conclusion, first, generally you begin the conclusion with a signpost phrase or sentence. A signpost is a kind of phrase or other type of hardcore transition that basically says we're changing directions here. Something has happened here and we are not doing what we were before. So previously we were going body paragraph, body paragraph, body paragraph, body paragraph. We hit the signpost, and the signpost says in summary or in conclusion, or taking all of this into account, or whatever else you can think of. In fact, if you can avoid in summary and conclusion, it's not a bad idea, because they're very overused. But they're overused for a reason. They work. When you suddenly come across the phrase in summary, you know that this isn't just another body paragraph. We're actually ending. Everything is drawing down. Everything is coming to a close. For those of you in 497, you might not have necessarily a single phrase. If you're using subtitles, for example, you'll have that big word there, conclusion, right in the middle of the text. And all of a sudden we know that we're doing something different, and that difference is important. You'll then give a summary of the evidence. And again, this is the tough part. This is where you have to be creative, because you have to bring all of this stuff that you've talked about, you have to draw it all together, you have to talk about it again, but you don't just repeat yourself. If you just repeat yourself, that is where it gets to be really awful and really boring, and people don't react well. So don't use the same wording, don't use the same phrasing, don't use the same sentence structure necessarily. Maybe break your points up a little differently. Whatever you have to do, do it. But the end goal is you want to bring all of this stuff together. You want to say, we've taken all of these things that we're talking about here, and we then re-emphasize the thesis statement. And I say again, do not just copy and paste the thesis. Try to find a different way to say it, but you're drawing all of these things together, you're bringing in all the weight of your evidence, and you're dumping it right on that thesis statement, and you're saying, in this case, Washington's leadership on training and supply, along with his personal sacrifices, made the difference at Valley Forge. If you look at that, that's essentially the same thing as that thesis we started off with, but we've said it differently, we've broken it up differently, and we've really driven our point home. And so, hopefully, if you've done this right, by the time you get to this point of your conclusion, people are going to would have to walk away thinking, I'd have to be an idiot to disagree with him or her. I mean, they've proved this so well, they've demonstrated this so thoroughly. I'd have to be crazy not to think that this was true. And then, after you've done that, it's generally a good idea to give a final thought. This is your last chance to really drive your point home, this is the last thing you want people to hear. This is your chance to leave a bit of yourself with your reader. And as we said, the best writers are going to be the ones that you walk away and you're still thinking about what they say hours afterward. C.S. Lewis, for example, was a master of this kind of thing. In every one of his essays, almost every paragraph, he's got these thoughts in there that you walk away and you're still thinking about it And what do? You go back and you read more C.S. Lewis. Well, as a writer, that's what you're trying to do here. You're trying to bring something in, and you're trying to leave someone with something that has real value, intellectually, emotionally, something. You want it to have real value, so that they'll want to come back and they'll want to hear more of what you have to say. Now, of course, again, as your professor, I'm going to read what you have to say regardless. But to be perfectly honest, I would encourage you to practice on me. Try to go ahead and think of things that you can say that might have that effect. I mean, I read these kinds of papers all the time. So if you can say something that will catch my attention and really keep me focused on what you're saying, hey, you're probably going to be in pretty good shape. And it's the final thought. I have a friend who calls it the mic drop moment, which is another good way to think about it. But that final thought, getting the balance right on that can be tough. Because on the one hand, you have the risk of sounding really melodramatic. You can make it sound like, so how did the immovable object react to the irresistible force and blah, 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 blah. And people walk away just going, that sounds silly. On the other hand, if you go too plain, people don't remember it. So the more you practice it, and that's the only answer for writing, is you've got to just keep practicing it. You've got to keep trying. All right. If you have some questions, I'll wait. Please note them. I will talk about them at the end. I want to get through Turabian real quick because your time is valuable, and I don't want to keep you up late on a Thursday night. So I'll get through this, and then we'll open it up for questions at the very end. So Turabian. Now, for those of you in 202, Turabian is something that you're going to be interested in if you think you're going to be a history major. Because Turabian, it's also called Chicago, and if you ever wondered about that, the Chicago Manual of Style is the official designation. It's like CMS is what you'll see it designated as, is the acronym. That's the really, really big, thick book. Turabian is a form of the Chicago Manual that has been significantly simplified. It was written by Kate L. Turabian, and so if you're wanting to use something that's not top-heavy, people use Turabian. But you'll hear people talk about Turabian in Chicago and whatnot, and they'll use the terms as synonyms, and they almost are, but not quite. So anyway, Turabian is the standard of professional history. So if you are going to claim to be a historian, and this also is why I really have to hit it hard in 497 and just keep harassing people about it. If you are going to claim to be a professional historian, if you are going to claim to actually have historical chops, you've got to know how to use Turabian. If you write a brilliant paper and then you just turn around and the paper's in MLA or APA or whatever, if you submit that for publication, people are going to look at it and they're going to think less of you. They're going to look at you and say, this is not something that we're interested in. So you got to get the Turabian right. And so, anyway, the very first question that I have, oh, and by the way, I meant to say this, for those of you in 202, Sharon's asking, what does it mean that Turabian is not top-heavy? Just the level of complexity that's involved in Chicago and every little aspect from the top down is simplified in Turabian. So if you're trying to do a Chicago paper and you're trying to do it completely right, there's a lot more to that and to getting that right than with Turabian. That's the best way I can think to put it. So Turabian is easier to follow than Chicago. Yes. history majors. Also, I believe religion uses Turabian, and several others. Government, I think, might. I'd have to double check on that. Anyway, so for those of you in 202, if you're going into the history major, I really would encourage you to go ahead and use Turabian. The sooner you learn the process, the better. It just get it over with. You know, it's like pulling teeth. The longer you wait, the more it's going to hurt. So just get it out. Just do it. Just get it taken care of. If you're not doing theology too, yes. And so if you're not going into history, if you're just taking 202 as your elective, you can use MLA or APA. Again, not an option for those of you in 497. You must use Turabian. So anyway, I like to stop and explain why we do things, because when somebody gives me a requirement and does not explain to me the purpose behind the requirement, it seems 10 times more annoying to me than otherwise. So hopefully, when I explain this, you'll at least see why Turabian makes sense as opposed to MLA or APA. So why not? Both MLA and APA are similar in that they use in-text parenthetical citations that refer to the infamous works cited or to the references page. And so that's one of the ways I can tell if somebody is not a history major, or if they grew up maybe in high school doing a different type of notation style. They will write a paper that looks vaguely Turabian-ish, and then they'll stick at the end of the paper works cited. Well, there is no works cited. There is no references page in a Turabian paper. We'll talk about that. But the idea behind it is you're going through the paper, you see a citation. It says something like Jones, page 75, and then what you do is you flip to the back of the paper, and on the back of the paper you got the works cited, you go Jones, Jones, Jones. Oh, Jones! There's Jones. Jones, this book, so on and so forth. That's one of the reasons why, if you've ever written a lot of MLA or APA papers, like for an actual residential program, when you turn your paper in, when you get it back, the back page has been torn off and restapled. And because what the professor has done is pulled off your works cited page so they can have it over there next to them as they're going through, and then they restaple it to give it back to you. Now, the problem with both is that they are rather stiff and limited, particularly for what historians want to do. Historians are notoriously suspicious people. They want to see all of your evidence at their fingertips, because they're not going to believe a word you say until you have proved it to them with multiple sources. And they don't want it buried in the back of a paper on the works cited page. They want to look right at the bottom of the page, and they want to see exactly what you're talking about. Also, MLA and APA are generally intended mainly for direct quotations from a single source. I've written some papers in MLA before for some literature, a literature journal I wrote for once, and you're just not going to use that many citations as opposed to a history paper. A good history paper could have dozens. I mean, even if it's a 10-page paper, you could have 20 or 30 different citations over the course of the paper easily. And so you're not MLA and APA. They're just, they do obviously use quite a few sources in quote and whatnot, but not on the level that history uses. They also are not intended to allow for extended commentary on the text itself. One of the things that you'll run into the farther you go into history is that the main body of a history paper or book generally tells a story or a narrative. But there are times when you have to explain, as the historian, how you arrived at certain conclusions. So you have to explain why you're telling the story this way as opposed to a different way. I'm trying to remember if I'm going to talk about this in a minute, so I hope I'm not going to repeat myself. But as an example, when I wrote my book on Henry Slocum, one of the very first things I had to do was figure out whether he was born in 1826 or 1827, because I found about half the sources said 1826, the other half of the sources said 1827. Now, am I going to stop my book in the first 3 pages to give you a long discourse about all of the sources and whether they are going to say 1826 or 1827, and why did I decide on 1827 instead of 1826? I mean, that's just not a thing that you want to do in your story, in your history narrative. At the same time, you need to do it. So where do you do it? You have to find a place to put these things, and that's not really what MLA or APA are generally set out to let you do. So you might wonder, why did you use MLA or APA for this kind of paper to begin with? And the answer is one word: typewriters. If you've ever tried to do footnotes on a typewriter, it is like pulling your teeth out one at a time. It is one of the most annoying and frustrating and pointless exercises. I graduated high school in 1994, to give you an idea of my age, and I was one of the last group to come through that was forced to take typing. I think the very next year they got rid of all the typewriters. It was still useful because it helped me learn keyboarding, but I had to learn all this stuff, and it was, it just made me love my computer even more. If you want to put a footnote into a typewritten paper, what you have to do is you get to the point where you figure out where the footnote's going to go. Okay, I need a footnote at the end of this sentence. Then you take the carriage and you tick it down 1 tick. And that makes it go back up just 1. Then you type the number. Then you tick it back up 1. Then you got to figure out, okay, this footnote's going to be 3 sentences long. These 3 sentences are going to take up 2 lines on the paper, I think. And then you take the carriage and you scroll down to the bottom of the page, and you figure out where your margin is. You draw a little line on it with pencil, and then you then you count 6 ticks on the or clicks on the carriage. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That gets you 3 lines up, and you draw a new line on there very gently, and then you go back up to where you were before, and you keep typing. And then you get to another footnote, and so you go put the number in there. Okay, this one's just going to be a few words, so it's 1 line. Then you go all the way down to the bottom. You go to your last line. You go, okay, 1, 2. That's another line. Draw a new line, and then of course, if you get to the bottom of the page, and there is and you've measured wrong somehow, you just wasted an entire page worth of effort. I don't know if you've ever seen the image of the guys on the typewriter surrounded by balls of paper that they've wadded up. It's very true, and so you could have just spent half an hour working on a page that you have to throw away and start over. So if you are going to be working with a typewriter using parenthetical references in parentheses, it's brilliant. You just get to the end of the sentence, you open parentheses, you write what you have to write, you close parentheses, you press period. That's it. And then you go at the very end and you write that works cited page. And oh, it goes so much more smoothly. You don't have to retype everything. Yeah. Well, if any of y'all happen to be using typewriters, then we can talk about MLA or APA as a viable option. But now that we have actually functioning computers, not a really good idea. So obviously the secret of Turabian is going to be the footnote or endnote. Footnotes and endnotes allow you to have extended references and discussions with a minimum disruption to the text. You know, when I had to have that discussion about the birth of Henry Slocum, all I had to do was go a sentence into the text, press a footnote, and then I could talk about it for whole paragraphs down in the footnotes. And if you didn't want to read all that, you just kept reading. All you saw was the one little number. On the other hand, if you're like, that's interesting, what's going on with this, you can go down and you can see the whole discourse about Henry Slocum and birthdays and whatnot. Also, Footnotes, well, I would say in general, use footnotes unless specifically allowed otherwise. If you're talking about a good history paper, if you're talking about history papers in general, they are going to assume that you should use footnotes. You know, those of you in 497, whoever designed the 497 class, I don't know why they use endnotes. I guess that particular professor liked that, but it is not the norm based on my experience in my career. Everybody pretty much expects you to use footnotes because they want you to have the footnote on the page with the information that you're referencing so you can go from one to the other without having to flip back and forth. So you compare the results and you can see why Turabian works so much better in your prose. If I were to, this is a sentence that came from a paper I wrote at one point, and I was making a comment, obviously, about a discussion, about a disagreement, and I said a number of corps commanders contradict this claim, and if I'm going to talk about a number of corps commanders, then I need to give more than one source. I need to show this guy and this guy and this guy and this guy and this guy. And so here, using MLA, we've got Fance, we've got Sears, we've got Woodworth, we've got Doubleday, we've got Fox, we've got Coddington. And the parenthetical reference is as long as the original sentence. Sometimes it could be longer. I mean, imagine, and so imagine that every other sentence. I mean, you're having to skip half the page as you're reading, not just get to the end of the page and skip the footnotes. You have to skip every other sentence, it seems, because it's all just citations. On the other hand, if you change it to a number of corps commanders contradict this claim, you've just got the little number. And if I want to go look at it, I can. I could pack 10 different sources in there if I wanted to, and it's not going to make a difference. It's not going to interfere with your ability to read my narrative. It also, like we said, works well for tangential points. So if you need to present a point and then explain how you reach that point, because some readers might question it, you can do it, but you don't have to interrupt the flow of your narrative in order to do it. So Turabian really does make sense, especially if you're going to be a professional historian. It's a useful set of tools for your ability to explain yourself. Notation styles in general are about presenting your research. It's all about showing all the proof of why you're right. And so Turabian lets you do that with as little interruption to your prose as possible. So some basics. Turabian always uses a title page, and it uses a title page without a running head. I can always tell when somebody's used to APA, when they turn in a paper, it's got a running head. No running head. Also, don't number your title page or include it in the numbering. The very first page of actual text of your paper should be numbered 1. And if you're looking at that going, how do I do that? Because Word wants to always stick the number 1 on the title page. You have to do a little bit of MacGyvering, but it's not that difficult. In a nutshell, the first thing you do is you go into the header and you say different first page. That will then take the number off of the first page. You then go into the page numbering feature and you tell it to start the numbering at 0. And so if you start the numbering at 0 and it's a different first page, there will be nothing across the first page. It'll count that as 0, and then it will move on and your first page will be page 1. Now if this is something more complicated, if this is something like a dissertation, then you're going to have more front matter. That's a different situation. You got to start dealing with sections. But for everybody, I think, who's here today, you don't have to worry about that. What I just said will work. You want to stick to 1-inch margins. There are some programs that'll try to do like 1.25, but it should be 1-inch margins, and you always double space. excuse me, you always double space unless it's a block quote, and we can talk about that in a little bit maybe. So those are the very basics. Some newer forms of Turabian do allow parenthetical references, but you have to note that first, check with your instructor. I can almost guarantee you that 90% of the instructors you have who require Turabian, when they say do Turabian, they expect you to turn in something with footnotes. So don't just assume that you can do the parenthetical references. Make sure that it's going to be okay. And then second, note that they do look different from MLA and APA. Turabian parenthetical references, if you're going to use them, stick the date into the parenthetical reference too. And so you can see what it looks like here. Author's name, the date of the work, comma, and then the page number. How often should you reference material? As in history papers, you need to provide references and supporting information for anything that you think someone might question or might not know. And you must, of course, use quotations and references. When you use quotations, you must reference the quotation. You must put the material in quotation marks. Anytime you're going to borrow somebody else's words or ideas directly. Probably the simplest way to describe this is try to imagine yourself talking to an intelligent friend and ask yourself, would I have to explain to this friend what I'm talking about? Would I have to show them where this information came from? If the answer is no, you don't need to worry about actually putting a reference for it. On the other hand, if the answer is probably yes, put some kind of reference, some kind of citation. And I think I'm going to mention this again later, but just in case I don't, I want to make sure I get it in here. Remember that in history papers, you do not have to have a quotation in order to put in a reference. Somewhere along the line, a lot of Americans have got this idea that you can only put a footnote in when you have a quote. And so they've been told things like you have to use 1 or 2 quotes per page so you can have references. But no, you don't have to do that. If you have information you want to back up with your research, all you have to do is get to the end of the section you want to provide information on, you press the button to put the footnote in, and you put the citation. So when people get down there, they can know they can see it, and they can say, okay, this is where this information came from. So you do not have to quote in order to use a footnote. You can put footnotes all over the place. Some of the papers I get from 497 will have 100 footnotes, and that is not in any way abnormal. But it doesn't mean that the paper is constant quotation. Anyway, I'm sorry, I followed a bit of a rabbit trail there. Talking about your intelligent friend. Should you cite this information? To give you an example of what you probably would and would not need to cite. You're talking to your friend and you tell them about Pearl Harbor. Would you need to tell them that Pearl Harbor happened on December 7th, 1941? Probably not. Generally, every educated, intelligent American is going to know that Pearl Harbor happened on December 7th, 1941. So you don't have to do that. On the other hand, if you were going to say there were this specific number of casualties at Pearl Harbor, or this was these were the number of Japanese planes involved, or these carriers were out at sea, or these battleships were sunk, they probably are not going to know that. And therefore, that's the kind of thing that you're going to want to cite. Remember, in general, the more you can give, the better and stronger and more impressive your paper is going to be. That's just a general principle. I'm going to try to move along a little faster. A Turabian paper is made up of the paper itself, and the footnotes or endnotes, and then an attached bibliography. There is no works cited page. Just emphasize that. There's no references page either in Turabian. All Turabian has is the paper itself and then the bibliography. Here's an example of the most basic note form. for a single author book. I'm not even going to try to go through all the different options with you. The best thing I can say is if you're going to do Turabian, first thing you can do is you can buy a copy of the most recent edition of Turabian's manual. That also is kind of nice too, because if your professor starts to question you, you can say, see, I found it right here. And most of the time people are like, oh, okay, if it's in the manual, you're good. But you can also go, there are various and sundry different Turabian guides out there on the internet that you can use for free. One good example that a lot of people really like is the Purdue OWL site. But in the end, all I can say is Google it, find one that you like, and use it. But here is an example of the most basic. The first reference, you're going to give the author's name, and the author's name is not going to be last name first. You go first name, last name, comma. You give the book title, then you open the parentheses, you give the publication city, a colon, the publisher, comma, and the year, close the parentheses, add another comma, page number, and period. Subsequent references do not have to involve all of that. You generally give the author's last name, and then you give the page number. Just simple and straightforward. And then referencing the same source and page number more than once in a row, you use the word ibid, which is a short form of a Latin word that basically means ditto. So if you're going to say, if the reference you're giving here is exactly the same as the reference you gave before, you just put ibid and that's all you have to say. Now ibid, I'll say this quickly, ibid has gotten to be a little more complicated in use because there are a lot of people now, technically ibid is supposed to just be, is supposed to be used only when you're using the exact same citation before. So let's say your previous citation was Jones, comma, 75. And now you're going to quote from Jones, comma, 25. You're not technically supposed to use ibid in that instance, because ibid literally means exactly what it was before. But what people have started doing is saying ibid, comma, 35 or 25 or whatever it is. And so, and people let you get away with that most of the time. But, you know, if you're concerned, again, check with your professor. The bibliography. There is a difference between the bibliography and a works cited. Everybody wonders, you know, why bother? Why not just use a works cited? Well, a works cited or reference page gives information only on the specific sources that you used in the paper. So if you quoted from it, if you referenced it in the paper, it goes in the works cited page. If there is a book that you read that helped you, but you did not cite it directly in the paper, it does not go on the works cited page. The bibliography, though, shows all the sources that you researched, not just the ones that you used specifically in the paper. So, of course, all of the ones you used in the paper are going to show up in the bibliography. But if you're doing your research right, if you're doing it well, then you're going to research more than you actually use. It's just sort of normal. I'm sure you've all heard the iceberg analogy, and that's true. So you go out and you're researching a 5-source paper. You may have used or read or referenced in some way 10 sources over the course of your research. You took notes, let's say, on 8 instead of 5. Well, even if you've only used 5 in the paper, list all 8 or 10 in the bibliography. Now, I should emphasize that you should only put sources in the bibliography that you actually consulted and are aware of. There is a process called padding your bibliography, and I knew a number of people in graduate school who used to do this. They just wanted to make their bibliography look much more impressive, so they would go and Google their topic, and they would put books that they'd never seen or heard of and list them in their bibliography. That's, in my opinion, dishonest. That's not what you're trying to do. So when I look at your bibliography, I'm going to be making the assumption that this is part of your research. This is something that you've done. So a bibliography is going to be broader than just a works cited page. And bibliographic information is going to be formatted differently than footnotes. This, by the way, is one of the biggest mistakes I see people make in Turabian. They use footnote format in their bibliography, and they use bibliographic format in their footnotes. So know that there's a difference. Read the guides that you're using carefully and make sure that you see the difference. So remember, before we said it was first name, last name, and then the publication information was in parentheses. Looks different here. For your bibliography, you give last name, then first name. Also, instead of a comma, it's a period. That you give Sherman's Forgotten General in this case, period, Kansas City, University of Missouri Press, comma, 2007. And so again, I'm not going to try to show you all the different things. Look it up in the guide of your choice, but this gives you at least an idea. So here is an idea of what a Turabian paper will look like. First, you have your title page. This is a title page for a presentation I made a number of years ago. And then, if you're just turning it into your average everyday class, this title page will probably be fine. You'll put maybe the professor's name, the class under where I put Turabian example paper, so on and so forth. But you've got the title about a third of the way down. About a third of the way down from that, you've got the author and the other information. Those of you in 497, there is actually a really formal way to do this. You might want to go ahead and do it the fully formal way. There will be instructions on that in the guides and in the Turabian guide itself. So worth doing. But you'll notice again, no running head, no page number. Here is the first page of that paper. You'll notice the nice big chunk of footnotes. Lots of detailed information in the footnotes. You've got got some explanations here that are useful. You've also got multiple references in each one of the footnotes. But you can also hopefully see again how you can read through this page. And if you're not wanting to stop and look at the footnotes, you can actually read the narrative, and the footnotes don't get in the way, but they're there if you need them. Here's another example. This has some of the short form citations in there. You'll notice a mix. Also, one of the things that's worth mentioning, if you look on footnote 14, you'll see Catton, Gettysburg, The Final Fury, comma 45. Meant to mention that if you're using more than one book by the same author, you'll use a short form of the title in the shortened citation. But anyway, hopefully not a very big deal. And then finally, here's an example of a bibliography. And well, I actually used most of these in the paper itself, but you see, pretty substantial. Starts last name, first name. If a citation or if an entry runs over one line, you indent the second line and the third sometimes if it goes that far all the way down here with Thomas Osborne. Anyway, hopefully that'll give you an idea of how to get along. So thanks for hanging in there and seeing this through to the end.